Field reconnaissance surveys and test mitigation and monitoring preservation obligations. So I told you he's an avid angler and outdoor enthusiast. He's been involved as a volunteer leader with Trout Unlimited since about 2010 and has served as the president, secretary, and is currently a board member of the local Miller Van Winkle chapter. He's also served as vice chair and chair of Michigan Trout Unlimited. Since 2021, he's been the National Leadership Council representative for Michigan TU, where he serves on the NLC Steering Committee and is chair of the NLC Great Lakes Work Group. In addition, he's represented Michigan TU on the Pigeon River Country Advisory Council since 2020 and was elected to the Watershed Council Board of Directors in 2023. He lives in Petoskey with his wife, Carrie. And I know you know Carrie's retiring.
Yeah, she keeps saying that.
And you're celebrating.
She's trying.
Actually, School of Ballet has a big performance, maybe at the end you could. Greg lives in Petoskey with his wife, Carrie. She's an instructor here at Crooked Tree, a beloved instructor with the GR Center, School of Ballet. And Greg, we're just really delighted to have you here.
Thank you.
The rough start here.
That's quite all right. I'm glad it was not on me. So thank you, Sheila, and thanks everybody for coming this morning. I'll kind of go over a little bit of what Sheila just read in the intro, but happy to be here to talk a little bit about conservation and mostly how I got involved in conservation and why. So, born and raised in Kalamazoo. My maternal grandfather there in the back of the boat was the one that got me interested in fishing. I developed interest in birding, camping, boating, and pretty much anything you can do outside. Attended Western Michigan University, undergrad degree anthropology with a biology minor, which was mostly focused on plant biology, and master's degree in anthropology at Western Michigan. After graduating, I got into the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign in the PhD program. So Carrie and I moved to Champaign, where we lived for 10 years, almost 9 years. Ultimately did not complete the degree program at U of I for a variety of reasons. But I did get a lot of experience in doing field work and also working as a research assistant for the Construction Engineering and Research Lab, which is in Champaign. It's affiliated with the Corps of Engineers, and they do a lot of environmental work, construction, engineering stuff for the Army Corps of Engineers. And at the time, this was in the early 90s, the Construction Engineering Research Lab was facilitating a lot of grants for archaeological work mostly on military bases. So we had about 6 or 7 years of tremendous amounts of archaeology on military bases all over the United States. Some interesting scenarios unfolded in some of those places. I'll talk about that a little bit later. My master's thesis at Western Michigan involved the study of plant remains from an archaeological site that dated to about 1425 to 1450 in the lower Kalamazoo River Valley. So just a little bit upstream from Saugatuck Douglas in the big marsh that's at the mouth of the river, Drowned River mouth. My advisor was a paleobotanical analyst, and so he had excavated the site prior to me coming to Western Michigan and had one of his grad students studied the faunal materials, one studied the pottery, one studied the stone tools. The last remaining assemblage was the plant remains. So I was interested in that, and so I looked at the plant remains from the site. The interesting thing about the site is it was a sturgeon fishery, a spring sturgeon fishery for Native American population, probably the forerunners of Potawatomi. Trying to think of the name of the bands now. They're Gun Lake Band of Potawatomi claims the mouth of the Kalamazoo area as one of their traditional cultural properties. So in the 1400s, we really don't have can't put tribal labels on archaeological assemblages that early, but you can kind of figure out where they're going. So it's probably a Proto-Potawatomi spring encampment where the focus was spearing and capturing sturgeon. There was about 70 pits excavated into the ground that were cooking pits full of charcoal and wood debris. And in the excavation notes, they said when they opened up these features to excavate them, you could still smell the fish oil from the quantity of sturgeon bones that were in there. The other interesting thing about the site was that several of the pits that were just full of sturgeon bones had bear skulls placed on top. They probably were not food remnants. They were some sort of an offering, a sealing. This pit is done. We'll come back next year and start again, something like that. So when I looked at the plant remains, being a spring encampment, there's not a lot of plant foods available, but what they were focusing on were tubers of the American lotus and water lilies. These are really starchy. They're almost like potatoes. So you can gather those tubers, you can steam them, and it's like having a very starchy vegetable, carrot, potato, that sort of thing. So that was my master's thesis. And again, there's a link to the fishing there, the sturgeon fishery, which, you know, the Kalamazoo River has historically been a tremendous sturgeon river. Even to this day, it's not anything like it used to be, but sturgeon still run the river. Fish and Wildlife Service has been planting sturgeon fairly regularly down there to keep the populations up. So we'll move in. I think Sheila covered this pretty well, but just my professional background. The research interest in archaeobotany really focused my archaeological interests in looking at the relationship between humans and the landscape. How do you make a living in, location X? You have to know what animals, what plants, what the climate is, all these things. And you make choices. I mean, you could come up with several different scenarios of say, living up here in northern Michigan. You could be focused on fishing. You could be focused on, small mammal and deer hunting. Or you could put all those things together, which is usually what happens, and you have a seasonal round. You don't stay in one place all the time. You may have summer camps, you have winter camps, you have fishing encampments, the whole 9 yards. So in doing that sort of research, I look constantly at soils maps, tell you what sort of soils, are they wet, are they dry, are they sandy, are they loamy, are they clay? Tied in with that, you look at old government land office survey plats, which for up here in northern Michigan mostly date to the 1840s. And when those guys were out, literally dragging a chain through the woods and sighting with compasses to set section lines to divide up the land, they were also charged with taking notes on what sort of trees were there, what's the nature of the country, are there mineral deposits? So if you look at maps from the UP, especially out in the Keweenaw and the Marquette area, they will say, traces of iron or sea copper here. And so these became very important maps for later development, whether it was logging or mining or whatever. But as an archaeologist, it's the data that they collected on tree species. Every corner there was a witness tree. They marked it. They said what type of a tree it was. Sometimes they said how high it was. And there's been a number of researchers who have gone back through all of those Michigan land survey maps and created this gigantic atlas based on the vegetation type. So you can flip through this thing, every square section is laid out, and you can see what the dominant forest type was in these various areas. So that's one of the things that really, again, makes the link between my career as an archaeologist and my interest in conservation. You don't see many old growth forests in Michigan anymore. We'll see why in a little bit. During my tenure at Western Michigan, I taught, I think, 3 field schools, teaching undergraduates the methodology of doing archaeology. Worked at some really interesting sites. Sumnerville Mounds down in Southwest Michigan, which is like a middle woodland burial mound complex, about 2,200 years old. I don't know if you've ever been through Sumnerville. It's a tiny little speck of a town. It did have the distinction of having the oldest continuously operating tavern in Michigan. I'm not sure if it's still open, but there's about 20 houses in town, and 3 or 4 of them are actually built on burial mounds. There's a church that's built on a burial mound. So, you know, for them, it was like, hey, this is a high spot, good place to put my house. No knowledge of why there was a mound there. And then at University of Illinois, I taught 5 field schools. And we worked at a tremendous site in the Upper Illinois Valley called the Grand Village of the Kaskaskia. If you know where Starved Rock is on the Upper Illinois Valley, about 100 miles west of Chicago, big sandstone bluffs. Starved Rock is this big, prominent bluff that sticks out, called Starved Rock because in the 1700s, the French built a fort up on top there. And the Indians tried to starve them out. They surrounded the place, and the fort didn't last very long. But on the other side of the river, this big flat floodplain, is this Grand Village of the Kaskaskia, which was a proto-historic, very large village that in 1673, Joliet and Marquette, on their way back to Michilimackinac from their trip down the Mississippi and back up the Illinois, they stopped at the Grand Village of the Kaskaskia. Marquette was asked to found a mission. Well, he says he was asked, but he founded a mission there, the Mission of the Immaculate Conception. Came back to Mackinac, went back in 1675, and perished on his way back up north. So the site has prehistoric components. It has proto-historic components with French trade goods, beads, gun flints, musket barrels, the whole 9 yards. Very interesting site. We worked there with the University of Illinois, Indiana University, Purdue University at Fort Wayne had a field school going there. Northwestern University had a field school going there. And the site's been known since about the 1940s. So a lot of local collectors have taken material, highly illegal, but have done that. So that was a pretty exciting place to work. And to just really, to be there and think, okay, Marquette was here, Joliet was here, Henri de Tonty was another famous French military guy, was here. The site ultimately was burned in 1680 by the Iroquois, who were great enemies of the Illinois, came in and burned the village while the men were off buffalo hunting. So it was the old folks, the women, and the kids laid waste to the place, burned it to the ground, desecrated burials, did just tremendous amount of damage there. So I've done this for 35 years now, I think. As Sheila said, phase 1 surveys, which is just going out and looking for sites. Phase 2 is where you found a site, you think this needs a little bit more investigation, so you do some actual excavations, either by hand or by machinery. And in phase 3, which does not happen very often, is when you say, okay, this is a tremendous archaeological site. You recommend to the client, you need to avoid this in your development. They come back and they say, we can't, we have to have that spot. So you say, okay, it's going to cost you $1 million now to excavate that site in its entirety. And when we leave, the site is gone, the material that was there, we have a record of it, we know where everything was, but now you can do your development. Phase 3s don't happen very often. They used to happen with more regularity. Now I think the developers they have a little bit more insight into maybe we don't need this 1 acre to be developed. We can have it as a park space. We can have it as an open space. And the one thing that really is problematic, and a lot of the phase 3 mitigations that we have done have been on burial sites, whether they're prehistoric Native American. I've excavated a number of those historic cemeteries from the 1800s. I know we had a job in Illinois about 20 years ago. It was a residential subdivision development west of Chicago. There was a cemetery that showed up on every map from the 1800s, cemetery, here it is. They somehow decided that that was the only place that they could put the driveway into their new subdivision. And rather than the state and the county saying, no, that's a cemetery, move your driveway, they said, well, okay, I guess if you're going to pay to excavate that site, go ahead. So sometimes it doesn't make sense. You try to talk to the clients and you try to say, move over here because we're trying to preserve archaeological sites. We want to identify them. We want to prioritize their significance, and the ones that are significant should be preserved in place and left alone. And the ones that are not significant, which is most of them, you find it, you map it, you write up a report, this is what we found, this is where it was, and we don't think that anything else needs to happen. Your development can go ahead. So that's kind of the job of cultural resource management is, and it's not really to find every site, it's to find those significant sites that need to be preserved. So I've worked 13 states, mostly in the upper Midwest, but as far as South Carolina, Kansas, Missouri, all the Great Lakes states, for clients including the military, the Coast Guard, FEMA, oil and gas pipelines, utilities, state and local governments, tribal governments, private developers, and some private citizens. That, if you're a private citizen and you get a federal loan to build a house or to do something on your property from the United States Department of Agriculture, say Rural Development Authority, they will tell you, you need to consult an archaeologist before you can do this project because we are giving you federal money, and under Section 106 of the National Historic Preservation Act, we are responsible for making sure that before you do your development, there are no significant archaeological sites. So probably surveyed somewhere around 100,000 acres plus or minus through the years, hundreds of sites, a lot of excavations. We've dug sites that are nearly 10,000 years old, Native American sites, to sites that date to the 19th century. So a wide range. Here is a little, we'll do the pictorial. So this is the archaeology section here. Most of the work looks like this. This is phase 1 survey. You can see 10-foot tall corn. It was probably 90 degrees. We were working for Enbridge on this particular project. So even though there was no Enbridge facility in this godforsaken cornfield in southern Illinois, we had to wear steel-toed boots, gloves all the time, and hard hats. We would always wear long sleeve shirts and cover your faces because I don't know if you ever walked through a cornfield. I would say don't do it because there's so much silica in the leaves, it'll just take the skin right off your arms or your face, your earlobes, your nose. So that's mostly what we do. Phase 1 survey. Client says, we got 40 acres, we got to develop it. You go out, you either walk it or you dig a hole every 15 meters, screen the dirt through 1/4-inch mesh screen, look for artifacts, examine the soil profile, move on, dig another hole. So that's the grunt work, and that's most of archaeology. Fort Riley, Kansas, that was one of the big military surveys we did. I probably surveyed at Fort Riley alone 15,000 acres of a really interesting location that's out in the tallgrass prairie in the Flint Hills. The old part of the base is all historic structures. Custer's house is on the quad in the old part of the base. When we first started working there, and I think this picture probably dates to that time, the Gulf War was going on. So the training was all mechanized infantry, these giant columns of tanks and, Humvees and soldiers and helicopters zooming overhead. We worked there for so many years that the training changed from the Gulf War to the Afghan War. And so an entirely different force profile, different weapons, different training. I've been screamed at by soldiers in both Arabic and Farsi, because we would have to check in with the range control. We're out on, this is a 150,000 acre base. They run it, it's their show. We would check in every morning with range control and say, we're going to training area 17, got 2 vehicles, 20 people. Okay, you're good to go. Most of the time, we'd never see anybody. You'd hear shooting all day long, but every once in a while, you're in the middle of some patrol and they're screaming at you and pointing weapons at you that are filled with blanks. So a little scary, but interesting. Made for interesting days out there. This is an example of a very nice phase 1 survey. I got hired by a lighthouse protection group to survey, this is South Fox Island out in Lake Michigan. They needed to rebuild the dock. This was a historic dock that had been built when they manned the station. The station is abandoned. Beautiful spot. Most of that island was privately owned at one time. There's an airstrip on the island. The state did a swap with the private landowner. So the state of Michigan now owns South Fox Island. You can kind of see over here, if I can get the pointer. Well, you can see where the boat that dropped us off, we had to use that little inflatable to ferry equipment and crew. So it was me doing the archaeological survey. So I got a shovel and a screen and all sorts of stuff. There was a geologist, he had core stuff. That boat almost sank when we were going back, that little inflatable. But it was a beautiful day. I mean, that's the kind of survey I could do all the time. The other interesting thing, and I had a photograph of it, but I didn't include it. This was probably early June. You can see how clear the water is. There were hundreds of suckers spawning in the shallows, and they were all, 1.5 feet, 2 feet long, just literally hundreds of them everywhere. Data recovery. So this is a site that we worked on down in Scott County, Illinois, down in the lower Illinois River Valley. The site is within the Naples Archaeological District. Naples is famous for numerous burial mounds and ceremonial complexes down here on the lower Illinois Valley that were first identified in the 1800s. Again, this is a community where there's a church that's built on top of a very large burial mound. People have driveways cut through burial mounds in their house sitting on top of it. You can see where the plastic tarping is. We were hired by the city of Jacksonville, Illinois. They draw their water out of the Illinois River and run it through a pipeline about 20 miles up into the hills in town. And they had built this very interesting water well. Somebody developed this thing in like the 1800s. It's called a Ranney collector well. Essentially, you dig about a 20-foot wide shaft down to the water table, and then you push out pipes horizontally that collect the groundwater. So this thing was gigantic, and they moved a tremendous amount of earth. We did not find this site. It was previously identified, but they needed to they were going to put another water main through there to feed out. You can see the bluffs back here. That's looking kind of to the southeast. So this is out on the Illinois River floodplain. And they needed to put this, and of course it's going to go right through the middle of this site that had been recommended for additional work. So we came down, we stripped off the topsoil with a bobcat and laid out, I think, 120 1x2 meter excavation units and excavated each one of those to sterile soil, which was about 1.5 meters down. So lots of artifacts, but we believe what we were looking at was the debris that was excavated and moved out from where they built their giant collector well. because there was nothing intact. There were thousands and thousands of artifacts, potsherds, copper items. Most interesting, we had 5 pieces of obsidian. We did X-ray fluorescence testing, which you bombard artifacts with X-rays. You get a signature of atoms that fly off, and then they can analyze that. That piece of obsidian came from Obsidian Cliff, Wyoming, traded into the Midwest. During the Middle Woodland time, it's kind of a cultural peak. Really elaborate pottery, lots of long distance exchange. Some of these Middle Woodland sites in Illinois, you do find obsidian. You'll find conch shells from the Gulf Coast. You'll find copper from the Upper Great Lakes, various types of stone from Ohio. So just, tremendous trade interactions. And then the last thing we do is archaeological monitoring. This is only something that happens in cases where there are known sites or there's a high probability for burials or important sites. So I've done a lot of monitoring for the city of St. Ignace in probably over the course of a decade and a half as they try to upgrade their water system in town there. It's really bad. We were working on Truckee Street. This is the edge of the road. And I saw this thing and I'm like, what the heck is that? And I start looking at it and you can kind of see there was a pit excavated. It's filled up with rock. This was a wooden barrel that had been filled with stone, set at the edge of the old road. So it was an early attempt at draining water off the road, because just downstream or downhill from here, it just really dives down. So you would have had just torrents of water tearing down the street. The other one over there, this was 4 or 5 years ago, monitoring just west of Fort Michilimackinac. They were putting in new water and sewer lines. There had been a number of human burials that had been encountered when they originally put the sewer lines in. So that was one, again, where they said archaeological monitoring, which means I'm there all day, every day. If the construction crew is digging, I'm there, generally standing around doing nothing, taking pictures, talking to the guys, whatever. But occasionally you do find something. In St. Ignace, I have found portions of 2 individuals directly underneath the streets of St. Ignace. So there's a reason why they asked for monitoring. And both those individuals were repatriated to Native American tribes. One went to Sioux tribe and one went to Bay Mills. So what does all this have to do with cold water conservation? So as I said earlier, my interest in the interplay between culture and environment is really what interests me. So I do study the soils, vegetation, land use ownership. You look at known sites, you try to create a model of where you think a site may be. And that's what really led me to, as I, would be out fishing somewhere, thinking about that, because I travel a lot. Most of the work happens in the summer, so I would spend a week or 2 in the 90-degree heat of Illinois, come home to Petoskey. First thing I wanted to do was get in the water and, physically and mentally cool off, right? So when I think about that, it's like, I've surveyed 100,000 acres. Most of those places, when you go back to them, there's 300 tract houses, or there's a community center, or there's a new artillery range at a military base or whatever. Sometimes we do work for conservancies every once in a while. So sometimes those lands are preserved. They just want to know, do we have any sites out here? Or is there anything we need to be concerned about? But in most cases, those acres are developed, and they're any sites that were there, we hopefully found them, we categorized them, and we dealt with them. And I can drive, all over the Midwest, and I can see a cell tower. Oh, I surveyed that cell tower, or I surveyed that, that development or that bridge or whatever. But that's what really made me think when we moved from Champaign up to Petoskey, that I needed to do something to kind of make up for that, get a little karmic justice, I guess. So we'll leave the archaeology behind and we'll get into just a little bit. I'm going to kind of skim the surface of a lot of things here in terms of the Great Lakes. So I figured we'd start off just by the numbers. So the map over there is a map of all the tributaries that drain into the Great Lakes and the upper St. Lawrence. Essentially what you're looking at there is the circulatory system of North America. I mean, this is it. 84% of North American surface water is in the Great Lakes Basin. 21% of the world's supply of fresh water. Over 10,000 miles of shoreline. Population of more than 50 million people in the Great Lakes. 10% of the US population and 30% of the Canadian. And these are 2022 figures, so things have changed probably a little bit. 25% of Canadian agricultural production occurs in the Great Lakes Basin, 7% of American. Gross domestic product, $5.8 trillion, or 28% of the US and Canadian economic activity. I mean, that's gigantic. If it was a standalone country, it would rank third in GDP, only behind the United States and China. This number, I think, is fairly astounding. Commercial, recreation, and tribal fisheries are valued at more than $7 billion and support 75,000 jobs. The Great Lakes support about 139 native fish species. The most important ones through history have been lake trout, walleye, bass, sturgeon, brook trout, not so economically important, but an important fish. 61 of the native species are considered threatened or endangered, and 18 fish species are extinct from at least one of the Great Lakes. So what are these native fish species? In the salmonids, you've got the lake trout, the brook trout. Atlantic salmon were present in Lake Ontario. They would come up from the St. Lawrence Seaway. Whether they were migratory or not, some fisheries folk think that they were landlocked. It was a landlocked population. They weren't technically landlocked, but they had large body of water in Lake Ontario. They had creeks to spawn in and rivers. And so they may have just been a resident, kind of a subspecies of Atlantic salmon. Ciscos, a lot of species of ciscos in the Great Lakes. If you go to a smoked fishery and you see smoked chubs, those are ciscos. They're salmonids. They look kind of like a mix between a trout and a whitefish. We'll talk about ciscos a little bit later. And the non-salmonids, the important species, the lake sturgeon, suckers, walleye, pike, muskie, the Michigan grayling, drum, I added in there because there were some commercial fisheries for drum back in the day. They can get quite large, up to 100 pounds in the Great Lakes. Panfish, your bass, perch, bluegills, minnows and chubs. Native Americans were obviously the first fisher folk in the Great Lakes. And their techniques would include spearing or gaffing, hook and line. We have archaeologically recovered a great number of copper fish hooks from the Archaic period, maybe 5,000 to 6,000 years old. Another thing that you find sometimes is called a gorge, just like a bi-pointed piece of copper or bone with a little groove in the middle, kind of a weird little artifact. The thought process is that those were tied to a line, stick them inside of a piece of bait, a fish or a minnow, throw that out, the fish eats it, the gorge gets caught in its throat, and you pull it out. Hand netting, weirs and fish traps. If you travel US 2 across the UP, you've passed the Big Fish Dam and Little Fish Dam rivers. Those were probably named because there were Native American fishing weirs on those streams. And gill nets. Chuck Cleland, eminent archaeologist who lives down in Norwood, retired from Michigan State University, has written extensively on the inland shore fisheries in the Great Lakes. And he says the inland shore fishery provides the most important single organizing concept for understanding the cultural developments of this region. And that the spawning cycles of native fishes is the key to understanding the evolution of subsistence and settlement systems of the Upper Great Lakes Indians. That's based on archaeological work and also ethnohistoric accounts. I stuck this torch fishing photograph or painting, not photograph. This was from, I think, 1850. I did not include the artist attribution, but this was said to be painted on the Fox River that flows into Green Bay. And these Indians were night spearing walleye during the spring, according to the author. So this brings us to one subsection of my title, Abundance, Despoliation, and Renewal. So abundance. Claude de Blon was the superior general of the Jesuit missionaries among the Ottawa. And he was for a time up in Michilimackinac. And so he says that the Straits of Mackinac, this spot is the most noted in all of these regions for its abundance of fish. Since I struck the derogatory word there, since in their, I will say their parlance, this is its native country. No other place, however it may abound in fish, is properly its abode, which is only in the neighborhood of Michilimackinac. So the Jesuits obviously are here in the New World to save souls, convert the Native Americans to Catholicism. They widely ranged. They were some of the most intrepid explorers and commentators on what they saw. If you ever have a chance to find translations of the Jesuit relations, they're online. You just open one up and start to read. They're just fantastic. I mean, the amount of detail that those guys were able to provide is astounding. And his remarks on the lake trout, I mean, this has really stuck with me. He says, there are here found three kinds of trout. One, the common kind. The second, larger, being 3 feet in length and 1 in width. I mean, that's a pretty large trout. And the third, monstrous, for no other word expresses it. Now they are so abundant that one man will pierce with his javelin as many as 40 or 50 under the ice in 3 hours' time. And you know, I don't want to talk about specific sites or site locations, but in the Straits of Mackinac, there is one prehistoric Native American site that has late prehistoric remains and also earlier prehistoric remains. That was a fall lake trout fishery, probably gill netting. When they excavated the site, I mean, again, just pits full of fish bone, lots of artifacts. And all around the Straits, all around the coasts of all the Great Lakes are just numerous Native American sites, either spring or fall fisheries for the most part. The lake trout was a fall fishery. So, you know, it's one thing to spear them through the ice. That would be kind of fun. But, you know, imagine yourself in a birch bark canoe in the Straits of Mackinac in October, setting and hauling gill nets full of fish. Makes you think, you know, whenever I drive across the bridge, that's what I think about. And I know where the site is that he's talking about, and so I can see that, and I think, God, you know, these guys were crazy. So a little bit more on abundance. As I said, we got artifacts that say at least 5,000 years of Native American fishing in the Great Lakes, which includes hook and line, ice fishing, fish dams and weirs, and it's also inland lakes and streams. These are not all Great Lakes sites. The inland sites are smaller. Obviously, the fishing technology and the catch was different. Here, this is a historic photo, probably from the, I don't know, late 1800s. But again, here's an account of Alexander Henry, who traveled through the Upper Great Lakes in the 1700s. And he's talking specifically about the Sioux. Says the fish are often crowded together in waters in great numbers, and a skillful fisherman in autumn will take 500 in 2 hours. This fishery is of great moment to the surrounding Indians, whom it supplies a large proportion of their winter's provision. For having taken the fish in the manner described, they cure them by drying in the smoke and lay them up in large quantities. So that's the other important thing about the fishing, is that this was a portable resource. Once that fish is smoked, you can stick it in a basket, you can bury it in the ground. One of the things that is a fairly common archaeological feature up here, they're hard to find, are these cache pits. In some places, they're all over. There's a large number of them up by Douglas Lake. But if you smoked fish, wrap it in birch bark, put it in a basket and put it in a pit, it's going to be edible some months later. It may not be of the highest quality, but still, it's going to get you through the lean times. So here we start to see the change. So 1879, there's already a lot of things that are happening in Michigan that we'll touch on a little bit later. But 1879, an article appeared in Scribner's Monthly Magazine by this guy Thaddeus Norris, who's recounting a trip he took in 1874 down the Au Sable River from Grayling. So he came up from downstate, found a guide, and the article is interesting. He talks a little bit about the landscape. The logging industry was already underway at this time, and so he talks about being led to some of these places by timber cruisers, the guys that are out looking at the stands, figuring out where they're going to cut and all this stuff. So in this article, he says, on our second day, we killed and salted down, heads and tails off, 120 pounds of fish, besides eating all we wanted. In one hanging rift close by the bank, as Len Iswell, his guide, or his pusher, they were probably in an Au Sable boat, and the guy's pulling him up and down the stream, held onto the cedar. I took at 5 casts 15 fish, because they would fish a 3-fly rig. So you have your line and you got 3 flies on it. 15 fish, averaging 3/4 pound each. Following day, we fished along leisurely until we had our live boxes containing each 60 pounds, so full that the fish began to die. Then we passed over splendid pools in which we could see large schools of grayling on the bottom without casting a fly, for we would not destroy them in mere wantonness. The fact that they already have 120 pounds in the boat between 2 guys kind of belies their wantonness comment there. But, you know, again, even as late as 1874, things are still abundant. There's a lot of fish, there's a lot of game, there's not very many people other than the native population, which by then is being disrupted and shoved out and, you know, trying to be shoved onto reservations and all that sort of stuff. So in the 1870s, pretty much the interior of Michigan belonged to the lumber companies. And, you know, there are other early, not advertisements, but people would write, you got to go to Michigan, you got to fish the grayling before they're gone, before the log, you know. So they already knew, even in the 1870s, that things were going to get real bad real fast. So, which leads us to despoliation. I would say probably the biggest factor is the logging industry, seconded only by the commercial fishing industry. This is probably somewhere out in the Grayling area, Pine Plains, dry sandy soils, which are not very productive, but they were great at growing white and red pine and some jack pine. And back in the day, there was no selective cutting. I mean, this was total take everything and leave the slash behind because there's no value in it. So you cut the trees and you move on to the next spot. So the 2 major species that were logged first were the white pine and red pine because they were most sought after as building materials. That was the first wave of logging. Slightly later on, the hemlock stands were targeted, not so much for the wood, but for the bark, which was used in the tanning industry. So they would cut down swaths of hemlock trees, drop them in the forest, strip the bark, and leave the wood. If you read Hemingway's little short story, The Last Good Country, when he has to run away from Walloon Lake because he poached fish and sold them to one of the hotel cooks, and the game warden was after him. And his little sister follows along with him. And they go for the Pigeon River country. That's where he's headed. And there's a passage in there where he's telling her this is the worst part. And it's this giant hemlock forest that had been felled, all the bark stripped from the trees, and all the tree trunks are just laying there in these massive piles. So, you know, incredibly wasteful. So commercial logging. I think the photograph on the top left there is probably the Au Sable River. You see the high sandbanks there. They'd pile up the logs on the edge of those banks and roll them down or shoot them down a sluice. The bottom photo, the only thing I could get from that one was that is Schoolcraft County up in the UP. Don't know what river that is, but underneath all that wood, there is a river. So commercial logging began in the 1830s in the Saginaw River Valley. Pretty much moved up the Au Sable. White and red pine were the targets, and by the 1850s were already being logged at a massive scale. By 1869, Michigan led the nation in lumber production, which is kind of hard to believe. The high plains along the Au Sable were, as I said, especially rich in red and white pine, and it provided the means to get the logs to the mouth at Oscoda. You rafted them together, down they went. Timber production peaked in Michigan in 1889 at 5.5 billion board feet per year. A board foot is 12 inches long, 12 inches wide, and an inch thick. That's a lot of wood. Most of the logging early on occurred during the winter. It was much easier to get a team of horses into the woods in the wintertime and drag the logs out on a sleigh. Later, they developed the big wheel. You see these sometimes. It's just a giant wheel, 2 wheels and an axle, and you could prop logs on it and drag them out with a team of horses. 1855, the first logging railroad was constructed in Michigan using horse-drawn carts on wooden rails, which is kind of crazy. And then by 1857, you had steam locomotives on steel rails, mostly narrow gauge. And again, if you look at early maps of Michigan, you see all these little railroad spurs all over the place that end at a logging mill or a logging town or whatever. So timber production started to decline by 1895. By this time, the lower peninsula pine forests were largely gone, and 160 billion board feet of lumber had been cut from the lower peninsula. And that, again, mostly pine. The secondary logging was the hardwoods. They were not seen as valuable, but once all the pine trees are gone, you have all the infrastructure. You say, well, we might as well start going and cutting all the maples and everything that we didn't get the first time around. So you can just see from these photographs the damage being done to the rivers just by the abrasion of the logs, scouring the bottom, destroying spawning habitats, covering up gravel, leading to erosion, and that's just the river itself. So the legacy of logging in Michigan, many archaeological sites relating to the logging industry exist. Lumber camps, rollways, skidways, dams, mill locations, and narrow gauge railroads. The environmental damage, loss of bankside vegetation, impediments to aquatic organism passage from the dams, the weirs, all the other blockages. This is a small dam on the east branch of Big Creek, which is a tributary to big creek and then goes into the Au Sable. So this is Au Sable County, out in the middle of nowhere on state land. This is a dam that Michigan TU is in the process of removing. It's on DNR property. The DNR wants it gone. It was first identified back in the 1980s and kind of written up. The dam was in much better condition. It's kind of hard to see. This is the deck of the dam. This is upstream, downstream. I was out there fall of 2024, I think. Here is standing downstream. So here's the face of the dam. These are vertical poles that would have held a sluice box. And the idea behind this little dam is that you build up a big head of water above it, you throw your logs in, you open up the sluice box, the water rushes out, the logs go downstream. Well, you can look at this stream. It's probably 15 feet wide and about 1.5 feet deep. Time? 10. Oh, I gotta hurry. So anyway, we're trying to get this taken out. It is a National Register eligible site. The DNR and the State Historic Preservation Office have said, yes, you can take it out, but you have to fully document it before it goes. So commercial fishing, the other great despoiler. 1790s, commercial fishing was already underway in Lake Ontario. Atlantic salmon were so plentiful that men slew them with clubs and pitchforks and women seined them with flannel petticoats. Trap nets wiped out much of the Atlantic salmon population in 5 years. Lake sturgeon. Early on, they were considered nuisance species because they'd get into the nets, thrash around, tear holes in the nets, and let the fish out. So they were just killed, used them to fuel steamboats, fed the hogs, or just stacked them on shore. And later in the 1860s, people realized that, hey, sturgeon tastes pretty good. So then there becomes extra pressure because then they're commercially fished. Just kind of the evolution of commercial fishing. Steam-powered boats and gill nets really upped the take. I think this particular statement here that on Georgian Bay alone in 1894, there were over 2,000 miles of gill nets in use. It boggles the mind, the scale of what went on. Other impacts, the Welland Canal gets excavated around Niagara Falls, allows the passage of the sea lamprey and the alewives into the Great Lakes. Both of those species have done tremendous damage. Other non-natives, these are more recent arrivals: round gobies, zebra mussels, quagga mussels, spiny water fleas. These came into the Great Lakes in ballast water of ships that sail from the ocean into the Great Lakes and dump their ballast water, along with whatever survived in the tanks. Trout Unlimited and a bunch of other conservation organizations lobbied strenuously for the Coast Guard to increase their regulation of ballast water discharge. And they did come out a year or two ago with updated ballast water discharge regulations, but they exempted all the current ships that are sailing in and out, and only new ships will have to have treatment in their ballast water, either heating or some sort of way to kill whatever may be in there. So non-native species and invasive species, 188 are now in the Great Lakes. 64 of these are designated as invasive. Cost of treating sea lamprey alone is plus or minus 26 million. On the good news front, an 85% decrease in non-native species introduced since 2006, but with 188 already here, that's still a lot of species. So all these things led to the foundation of Trout Unlimited in 1959. Group of concerned anglers, mostly property owners, big industrial magnates that had property on the Au Sable River. They were very unhappy with the state of the fishery because it was supported wholly by hatchery fish. So the state of Michigan had hatcheries, they were raising trout, dumping them into the river so fishermen could have something to catch. Well, any fisherman knows that a hatchery raised fish will eat pretty much anything. So there was no sport in it. And so these guys saw that, hey, we're catching fish, but this is not a way to treat natural resources. So these guys got together. Their guiding principle was take care of the fish and the fishing will take care of itself. And they were really, in the 1950s, early 60s, were really science-based. So in 62, 63, after they founded Trout Unlimited here in Michigan, they urged the DNR to stop this put and take fishery and stocking, and they did. And shortly thereafter, TU chapters sprung up in Illinois, Wisconsin, New York, Pennsylvania. Our Mason Griffith Founders Chapter is chapter 001, the first one in the nation, out of roughly 300. So here's TU today. I show this map zoomed in from the nationwide map for a particular reason. All of these green shaded blobs are what we are calling priority waters. So Trout Unlimited, we have 38 state councils, about 300 chapters. Most of the chapters work in their watershed. They do stream restoration projects, they do cleanups, they have meetings, but they're kind of atomized. Our chapter here works here, chapter in Illinois does Illinois. In order to kind of unify TU, we came up with this concept of shared priority waters. These are waters that all the state councils went through, came up with lists to nominate, which waters you wanted to be shared priority waters that all TU members should be concerned about. So in Michigan, we chose the White River, the Pure Marquette, the Manistee, the Au Sable. We couldn't not choose the Au Sable. And then up in the Upper Peninsula, the Manistique drainage, which includes the Fox and the East Branch of the Fox. And out in the Western UP, this is the Black and Brule system, which drains and connects with a priority water in Wisconsin. And then you can see the dark outline on the north shore of the UP. That is the Coaster Brook Trout priority water area to try to rehabilitate possibly the native form of brook trout, which live in big lakes, sometimes come in to spawn. Some populations apparently spawn in the lakes, but very different from our stream resident brook trout. And we have over 300 priority waters across the country. We chose these in Michigan largely because of the ability to work with partner groups. Most of these priority waters occur in large areas of federal forest land. So United States Forest Service and Fish and Wildlife Service are our big partners in dealing in projects in these areas. My TU story, about 2010, living here in Petoskey, I started to attend a few of the Miller Van Winkle chapter meetings. Brian Kosminski, Kos, either love him or you hate him. Everybody knows him. He was the one that got me involved in the chapter. I was president of the local chapter 2012, 2014, secretary, a whole bunch of positions. I'm still on the board. And I began to attend the Michigan TU Council meetings in 2012, where I met Dave Smethurst, who is really my mentor in TU and conservation. Spent a lot of time with Dave driving back and forth to meetings. He was not willing to drive 5 hours to go to a meeting and drive 5 hours back. So I'd pick him up in Gaylord and we'd drive and chat and he'd smoke cigars and just had wonderful conversations. Dave was a founding member of the Pigeon River Country Association, which formed in the late 60s when the oil and gas companies wanted to start oil and gas production in the Pigeon River. Dave was the spearhead of that. He was founder of the Headwaters chapter of TU, executive director of the Headwaters Land Conservancy, and just a fantastic guy. Really made me feel that I had something to offer to TU, which was important. And Dave passed in 2021. Served as Michigan TU chair, vice chair, and currently, as Sheila mentioned in the intro, I represent Michigan TU on the National Leadership Council. And when we were working on those priority waters, I talked to our executive director and I said, you know, Brian, this is great. We've got these priority waters, but we're not talking about the Great Lakes. We can't have priority waters that drain into the Great Lakes and have species that use those waters in their life cycle. So I lobbied TU, wasn't sure how it was going to come out, but I said, look, we need to include the Great Lakes as priority waters. We're not going to do projects per se in the Great Lakes, but we're going to advocate for their preservation. So I've represented Michigan TU on the Pigeon River Country Advisory Council. We have a permanent seat since we were party to that consent decree that limited oil and gas production to only the southern portion of the forest. And in 2023, I joined the board at Tip of the Mitt Watershed Council and really enjoy working with those folks. Renewal, the growth of organizations, Trout Unlimited, Anglers of the Asable, Backcountry Hunters and Anglers, Nature Conservancy, all these groups take people who, maybe took a walk in the woods one day and thought, well, I need to become, worldwide organizations in some case. The collaboration between conservation organizations, nonprofits, state and federal governments, and tribal governments is critical to keep this work moving forward. Nobody can do this on their own. We at Michigan TU have a very small full-time staff. We have great donors. We get great projects, but we can't do them without, partnering with either a federal agency or a local government or a tribe. Demographic challenges are really hitting us at Trout Unlimited, older and whiter. I'm 64 and I am below the average age of a Trout Unlimited member, which is fairly shocking. And our membership is declining, as are most conservation organizations. We're having trouble hooking in to younger folks. Not sure why. I think a lot of it is just a lack of trying, and now it's kind of too late. The demographic cliff is staring us in the face. Hopefully that will change. With all the uncertainty with our federal government right now, projects have started and stopped off and on. TU National had $230 million of either signed contracts or agreements with 8 federal agencies to do conservation work. And 2 months ago, all that was, who knew? Now, slowly, some of that is coming back. But how do you conduct conservation when you have to partner with federal agencies and they're pulling their funding, they're pulling their scientists, telling everybody to go home, we'll worry about it later. It's not going to be sustainable. Another renewal thing, a week ago, we had the grayling ceremony out at the Odin Hatchery. Michigan DNR partnered with Grand Traverse Band of Ottawa and Chippewa, Little River Band of Ottawa, and Little Traverse Bay Band Odawa, and handed off about 200,000 grayling eggs to those 3 tribes. And on the afternoon that they got the eggs, they were already in the Maple, the Boardman Ottaway, and in some small streams in the Manistee. It's experimental. We're not sure how it's going to work out. I know the Little Traverse Bay Band they're doing some experiments with grayling in their hatchery. crossing different age classes and all that sort of stuff. It's an experiment. Will it work? Maybe. If the grayling does swim in the streams again, it won't be the Michigan grayling, which was a subspecies. It will be Arctic grayling. These eggs came from Alaska. So a little bit different. And just again, the last grayling was caught in Michigan, 1936. So how can you help? You can join a conservation group, make a donation, make a planned gift from your estate, volunteer. All the conservation groups up here, whether it's the Land Conservancy, Tip of the Mitt, TU, we do river and stream cleanups, work bees, you know, tree planting, all that sort of stuff. Engage with your elected officials and let them know. You know, I'm sending emails to my congressman like on a monthly basis. Don't usually get very uplifting responses from him, but we do it. And the most important thing you can do is educate yourself. Know where you are, know what is here and what was here and what could be here again. So there we are. Thank you. I had to throw in one hero pick at the end there. That's an ensemble, about a 25-inch brown trout from a number of years ago. And a leaf on I think that was the upper Manistee, but it spoke to me. So any questions, comments? We have time left, or are we? Nothing?
Well,
Yes. That trout was laying up against the bank and I threw a streamer and the streamer hit the water and I think the trout had its mouth open and it was just bang. And I was with Rob Smith, who at the time was our Michigan TU chair, and Brian Burrows, our executive director. So kind of a good day. It was a good day.
thank you so much.
Thank you. Thanks for coming.